Hello, my name is Darren Thomas and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion on more ways or more assessing of reading in the context of ESL. So, as you can see, there are 4 levels at which you can assess reading in the ESL context. We talked about the first 2 in a prior video, perceptual and selective. In this video, we're going to focus on interactive and extensive. So let's continue. So, interactive level at which you assess reading in the context of ESL is focused on top-down processing. By top-down processing, we're talking about focusing on the meaning or focusing on comprehending the text. This is in contrast to bottom-up processing where you're just trying to read the text. And we talked about that in a prior video. Now, here are some examples of what top-down processing or if you will, what interactive level assessment looks like. Our first example is going to be what we call closed. Closed is where you remove words from a sentence or a paragraph and the students have to fill them in. Now on this particular screen right here, we have 2 different examples of closed, fixed ratio and rational. So with fixed ratio, you remove every nth word. For example, you might remove every 5th word, or if you look at my example here, you remove every 3rd word, etc. And the student has to somehow read the text and try to determine what is an appropriate word to put in the text. With fixed ratio, it's always, like I told you, the same distance. And so different words are removed at different times. If you look at the second example here at the bottom, rational is where you remove words for a specific purpose. So if you look at the bottom one, it seems like most of the time I focus on removing verbs. John blanked to the store, probably went. While he blank was there, he bought some water and an apple. Later, he went back to his house, or he returned, whatever. So in every sentence here in the rational, I removed, if you will, I removed the verb. And so the student has to try to figure out what is the appropriate verb to make this sentence flow, but also to fit with the rest of the paragraph. So that's how rational works. Let's move on now. Another example of interactive level assessment is something called information transfer. This is where the student has to interpret a picture or interpret a passage, and they have to try to explain that in a different context. So here on this screen, we have a picture of a graph, if you will, or perhaps a diagram, depending on what page you're looking at. And the student has to try to take this graph or take this diagram and put it into English. This is a very common strategy with the IELTS, if you're familiar with that, in that with their task 1, they have you take in, if you will, look at a graph, and you have to explain it. Looking at the graph requires reading, and of course the response may require speaking or writing, if you will. But if they cannot understand what they are reading, it'll be very difficult to explain this using words and or in writing. And of course, at the interactive level, you can also have other forms. I'm not going to go into deep detail about these, but examples include true and false and multiple choice, if you will, and other forms of assessment. Now, moving on to extensive level. Extensive level is very, very complex and very open in terms of how you address it. The most common way to address extensive level assessment or reading is the summarize and react method, if you will. This is where the student has to do 2 things. First, they must summarize what they read, which requires medium level of thinking on Bloom's taxonomy, if you are familiar with that. And then they must react or share their opinion about what they read. Now, this is very, very, very difficult for many students to do, in that they have to not only just talk about what other people thought, but they now must express what they are thinking about what they read. Very, very challenging. And again, the most common forms to produce this information will either be verbally, as like in a class discussion, and or in writing, where the student has to write, a short little, 1-page reaction or a paragraph or 2 or whatever. So that's reading assessment at the extensive level. So in this video, we took a look at how to assess students at the interactive and extensive level in terms of reading assessment in the ESL context. So with interactive, you're looking at top-down processing. With extensive, you're really trying to push their minds into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, evaluating, creating, synthesizing, if you will. And these are tools that can be used not only by ESL teachers, but also for any other teacher who was looking for strategies to help their students. So, my name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. I want to thank you for listening.